because we talk about spiritual readiness in the military, but then it's kind of like there's not a lot of specifics that goes with that. What is that? Is that going to church? Is that prayer? Is that there's a lot of tippy-toeing around this topic because it is very personal, very sensitive, but I wanted to study that religious spiritual component to be like, how does this impact resilience on mental health of military spouses?
Welcome to More Than a Milspouse, the podcast for military spouses who want to live with more meaning and less overwhelm. I'm your host, Christine, seasoned military spouse, mom of 3, life coach, and your guide to intentionally designing a life you're excited about as a military spouse. I'm here to help you get the clarity you need so you can get unstuck and unlock your purpose and potential. Because you, my friend, are more than a milspouse. You have something valuable to offer. And when you pursue the things that light your heart on fire, you trade frustration for fulfillment and isolation for a life of impact. It's time to discover who you are meant to be, because together we can change the world. Welcome back to More Than a Milspouse in the Milspouse Transformation Series, as this summer we are walking through my favorite tool for self-discovery, growth, and transformation. I created the growth wheel and the Milspouse transformation assessment to help you figure out how to transform your life from the inside out. Too many military spouses spend their life waiting for the right season, the right circumstances, the right job, the right number of kids, the right location, but a life filled with joy, with meaning, with purpose, a life that lights you up, that makes you excited to get up and get going in the morning, that's possible today. Life may not look the way that you hoped or planned, but you can still have a pretty amazing life right where you are. And so this summer series is designed to help you get there. If you haven't already, go back, listen to 207, where we kicked off this series. And when it comes to our health and well-being, there are 3 core components: our mind, our body, and our spirit. We've talked a lot about our mind and about our mental and emotional health on the podcast. And we've talked a fair amount about our physical health. But the one area where we haven't paid as much attention, that we haven't given as much focus, is our spiritual health and well-being, and why it matters as a military spouse. This is perhaps the least talked about area because we don't always have great language for it. But there's data that indicates that this is truly important. And that's why I really wanted to have this conversation inside today's episode. And I knew the perfect person to have this conversation with because Dr. Sharita Knobloch appeared on our podcast last year. She was the executive director of Mission Milspouse. But as we got to talk, she started telling me about her research and her dissertation, which was focused on military spouse mental health and resilience. And I knew that we needed to have this conversation because her research dug into the spiritual health component. So here's my conversation with Dr. Sharita Knobloch. Sharita, I was perusing your bio before we started today. You have a bachelor's degree in animal science, a master's degree in Christian leadership, and a doctorate in community care and counseling. That's pretty widespread interest.
Yeah, I mean, as we talked the last time, a year ago, all about that no plan, 15, oh good grief, almost 20 years ago. That's kind of gross now, of like getting my undergraduate degree. I knew Jesus, but I wasn't like pursuing him vocationally, and I was still dipping my toes in. So, but I grew up on a farm in small town Kansas and felt that, animal science really fit well for what my passion was. I initially had dreams or visions or, pursuits to go to veterinarian school. But again, the Lord knows much more than we do. And so I think it was my junior year of college. I did 5 years. So I did a victory lap. That's what I call a victory, a fifth year senior. My junior year, when I'm getting ready to take organic chemistry and I'm in the middle of physics, I was like, this is disgusting. Like, I like science, but I love more the biological science more than anything. And I really felt like it was the Holy Spirit, even though I didn't really know that at the time, of, hey, you work better with people than with animals. And the cool part is, if I would have applied to vet school and gotten in, I wouldn't have had the freedom to marry the man that I married and do what the Lord really had lined out for me. So I don't regret at all the animal science degree. I'm not using it per se, but I've also been a career counselor in a previous life. And the biggest part for me about getting an education was employers, if you want to vocationally work, they just want to know that you learn how to learn, right? So our joke was, it could be an underwater basket weaving. If you successfully went through all 4 or 5 years and finished it and you have the capability to learn, that's really what matters. And so there's a clear delineation between my undergraduate degree and, hello, meeting Jesus, this is the game plan, new complete no plan. And that shift from when I married my husband really started leaning into that religious spiritual component of my life that I knew was missing, but didn't know what to do with it. And then it just kind of escalated into the educational journey side with my master's from Liberty in Christian leadership. And then eventually, a few years later, that doctorate of education in pastoral care and counseling.
It's just interesting to see all of our journeys and where we start out and the things that we take that step to see what we're passionate about and how we pivot over time and we get led by God to the place where we ultimately need to be and see how all of these pieces of our life come together. And I can't wait to dig into this with you more. But first, just catch us up on what's been going on in your life since the last time we talked.
Well, I feel like things, I want to say, have slowed down, but I guess they've just kind of changed flavor a little bit, because I don't think I've ever met a military spouse who's like, life's super chill. I got nothing going on. Whether you work full-time, part-time, volunteer, have kids, are child-free, whatever, my husband always is like when I look at him and I'm like, what is going on right now? What are we doing? He's like, hey, good news. Your life's not boring. And I was like, yeah, that is an adjective I will never use to describe my life. I'm never going to say things are boring. So I guess since we last talked, this last December, I retired from Mission Millspouse as executive director after serving with the organization for 10 years. So my season with that had concluded, and it has freed me up in a way of a little less computer time, but I've really been able to lean in more to enjoying my family, to being less stressed out. Not that it wasn't a wonderful thing, but you can only do so much, and there's a season for everything. So it's been really wonderful for me to lean into my family, really honestly support my husband in Sergeant's Major Academy, because we knew that was going to be a big thing for him, as far as he does not like to write. That is not his jam at all. Last night we were at the kitchen table kind of late because he had an assignment that was a really quick turnaround, like less than 24 hours from the time it was assigned to the time he had to write, revise, submit. And so we had Bible study last night, and we're not normally late workers, but it's like 9:31, and he's got the paper done. He's like, I would rather go to war than write this paper. And I was like, yeah, you're infantry. I get it. Like, let's put the commas where the commas need to go. So it's been really wonderful to have bandwidth for me to support him in this highly academic endeavor, which is not his jam, but he's been very successful. And now we're at the home stretch of that. So he's getting ready to wrap that up, and just still been doing my job, dissertation chair with Liberty. So helping, I think I have 19 students on my caseload, coaching and mentoring them on their dissertations. And I've made a few doctors since that time, not that kind of doctor, but it's been a lot of fun. And just having a little bit more downtime to be with people and to go on weekly froyo dates with my kids and fold laundry before it completely overtakes the laundry room and the living room. of impending doom, that's really where I'm at today.
Well, and it's so nice. And, we talk about how we are never bored and we always stay busy. But when we can create that space to have that bandwidth to do the things that really bring life and bring joy and allow us to focus on our family, that makes such a huge difference. And I think it's interesting because we stay busy, but we also, as military spouses, often go through these seasons. And so, for you, having a husband with a job or school this year where he needed that family focus, it's not always going to be like that. But you had the flexibility to change your schedule to make that work for the season, knowing it's not going to be this way forever.
Yeah. And just having a little bit more margin and taking care of myself spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, all those things, so that I'm not so stressed, and that gives me some space and bandwidth to really work on, again, what God is calling me to do, whether that's, being mindful of my feelings and emotions and just not feeling overwhelmed all the time of how much can I possibly shove into today. Be like, I could take a nap if I want, or go for a walk, and not, I'm kind of over the season of hustle, at least for a season. Like, it'll probably come back around, let's be honest. But right now I was like, I'm good. I'll do my job, get ready to PCS, try to keep my kids alive and passing school, and support my husband best I can. But just kind of wanting to be where the people are is really my MO right now.
And that's really what leads us to this place of health, because if we're going all out, pursuing our purpose, doing the thing that we feel called to do, but we're not taking care of ourselves in the process, then we're going to hit that place of overwhelm and burnout, and then we're going to have nothing to offer. And so what you are modeling for us is such a healthy way of taking that time to understand that, hey, I need space for my family. I need space and margin in my life. I need to care for my physical well-being, my mental well-being, my spiritual well-being. And that is really what this whole series is about. So I would love to focus particularly on our spiritual well-being today. But you really started to look at this through the lens of how this impacts military spouses. So take us down that road of where and what led to your dissertation topic.
I feel like most strong dissertations come from a point of passion or experience. I see that in myself. I see that in my students, because it has to be a topic that, plus or minus, you'll never get sick of. Now, you're going to get sick of the dissertation process and be like, wrap it up, I'm over this, but you're still very passionate about the dissertation. So now, several years after I've defended and, I've recovered from the process, if someone's like, tell me about your dissertation, man, it's all I can do not to just talk their face off for hours, because I'm still so passionate about it. So my dissertation was all about military spouse mental health, because been there, done that, suffered through the trenches. I've struggled with depression in the past, and I didn't know it until I knew it. I had anxiety, didn't know it till I knew it. And then, of course, stress. So those are the three components that I really analyzed. And something from my own walk of, as military spouses, resilience has almost become kind of a dirty word. I think sometimes people really get sick of, like, if you call me resilient one more time, like, I dare you. But instead of viewing it as a negative thing, because it's been so indoctrinated in us of like, you're resilient, and we believe it. But if it was really true, like, do we have the skills and the know-how and the resources, then why is military spouse mental health such an issue? Because it still is 3 times higher than our civilian counterparts. Like, that's what the previous literature said. My dissertation substantiated that as well. So I was like, what is the one component that, first of all, I'm really passionate about, and secondly, that I've never really heard or gotten taught? And this is not at all a pushback or an attack or a really criticism of the military or the Army or fill in the blank. It's not a it's just like we're missing the mark a little bit, I think, of something we haven't really gotten a chance to lean into yet. Because we talk about spiritual readiness in the military, but then it's kind of like there's not a lot of specifics that goes with that. What is that? Is that going to church? Is that prayer? Is that there's a lot of tippy-toeing around this topic because it is very personal, very sensitive. But I wanted to study that religious spiritual component to be like, how does this impact resilience on mental health of military spouses? So the Cliff Notes version of all that is my key demographic, of course, was military spouses. I was able to survey 1,079 of them, which is huge and a little bit crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I told my dissertation chair that, like, because I felt like it was a calling from the Lord of like, I want to survey 100 or 1,000 military spouses, plus other research was like, if you have this many variables, you need 1,072 to make sure you have statistically significant data, blah, blah, blah. I told my chair that, and he's a good guy, but he immediately was like, never going to happen. And I was like, okay. I felt like that was from the Lord. And then just a few minutes later, he came back around and he's like, hey, I'm sorry. I should not have said that. You could be, this is what he said, you could be the Rachel Ray of military spouses. And I was like, that is a random person to pick, but thank you. Like, I'm not, but I do have a really great tribe, right? I have a very strong online social network and tribe. So I wanted to explore how religion and spirituality impacts military spouse mental health, depression, anxiety, and stress through that mediator of resilience, moderated by deployment, rank, and social support. So a lot of fun diagrams and bells and whistles on that kind of escalated, but that's kind of in a nutshell what my dissertation foundationally was about.
I think it's so important because I could bet money that almost everyone listening to this has dealt with the stress, who has gone through these seasons of feeling anxious, of struggling and having feelings of depression. Like, this is so common among military spouses. And you're right. I love the word resilience, but it has become, in many senses, a dirty word because we're told that we're resilient, and yet we don't feel that way, that we're not able to navigate all of this extra stuff. Like, how do we handle it? What do we do? Well, if we're told that we're resilient and yet we don't know what to do with it, there's something that feels off there. And what I always like to say is that it is a skill that we learn. It's not just something that you are because something bad happens to you.
Absolutely.
So talk to us about what you learned through this process of studying 1,079 spouses.
So I guess, I don't know if I want to say the cool part, like, a vast majority of my research did produce statistically significant results. So just basically, the percentages, the prevalence rates for anxiety, depression, and stress. Depression, 26.3% of spouses had experienced moderate to extremely severe symptoms of depression within the last week. Anxiety, right up there as well, 33.1%, and then stress was 28.1% of this very large sample. So the scale that I used to measure depression was actually, so I had the scale that's, externally and internally valid and reliable and all that. But the depression rate from the scale, I also asked an open-ended kind of question at the end of the mental health section of which of the following have you previously been diagnosed with? Anxiety, depression, stress. Well, I guess stress went on there, but anxiety, depression, substance use disorder, PTSD, and suicidal ideations. And this is what gave me a little bit of, it seemed to make my study a little more valid because the previously diagnosed percentage that people clicked was identical, like to the 10th of a percent, like 26.3% of what the scale actually said. So I was like, okay, we're onto something here.
Mm.
So, and those statistics still, even after COVID, are still 3 times higher than our civilian counterparts. So that was a huge thing. And a total of 36.8%, so 397 spouses in my study, had been diagnosed previously with some type of mental health issue. So over a third have some type of mental health issue, whether that's depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, PTSD, or suicidal ideations.
And that's just the percentage that was diagnosed.
Right. That's just the actual like diagnosed piece. The ones that haven't been diagnosed, or maybe we're masking some of those things, or who knows. So, you know, there's no research that is absolutely perfect. But again, the bigger the sample, the more potentially accurate it's going to be, right? So 2 other really big findings that are highly notable within this. I found that religious coping of all of my scales was the most powerful when it came to reducing depression. So it was the largest unstandardized coefficient in the entire study, which essentially means that as religious coping goes up 1 unit, depression, so when it directly on depression, as religious coping goes up by 1 unit, depression actually decreases 3.3 units. For me, that was pretty powerful and mind-blowing of like, okay, what do we need to do to like foster and cultivate this religious coping, like these skills? Because again, not at all a knock against our system and our programs, but I've never had anyone within the military sector come to me and say, you're struggling with this. Let's talk about religious coping. Not, leaning on the Lord, prayer, being with community, because there's so many dimensions to that. You can access it 24/7, right? But you have to have someone teach you and disciple you, especially if you're like me and didn't necessarily grow up in a Christian home. God was not a source of comfort for me growing up. He was a source of fear, and not fear and reverence, but like, smite me, O mighty smiter, right? He wasn't a person or a thing I turned to. So I needed someone to instill truth in me and to teach me that. And I didn't have that. So I was just making up stuff as I went, trying to figure it out. So the religious coping was huge. Daily spiritual experiences was also very prominent in how it influences our mental health. So those were 2 really essential components of the religious spirituality scales that I had used. And then finally, again, we go back to that resilience piece. Man, this was a little bit mind-boggling to me. So there were correlations between resilience and all the mental health variables. Like, they're all connected. Great. Makes sense, right? But there was a significant discrepancy because I had a valid, reliable measure by all the other brainy researchers in the world, the Brief Resilience Scale. And so it's just a 6-question measure of how, essentially I bounce back from adversity, those kinds of questions. So I did the scale, and at the end of that scale, again, an open-ended kind of question, like a sliding scale, on a scale of 1 to 100, how resilient do you think you are? Okay. So that measured perceived resilience versus actual. The scale was actual, the sliding scale, the open-ended question was perceived. It was almost, Christine, totally inverse. So 85.2% of these military spouses perceived themselves, like believed themselves to be highly resilient with that cutoff score, that top 1/3. However, on the actual resilience from the Brief Resilience Scale, only 12% of spouses were highly resilient. So like that discrepancy of we as military spouses totally believe we are resilient, but actually we're not as resilient as we think we are, which substantiates the mental health issues that we have, right? And I'm not saying, again, I'm not at all knocking military spouses. I are one, right? I are a military spouse. So it's not that it's not our fault necessarily, but the past 20 years, especially since the global war on terror kicked off and then concluded in a 19-year span, resilience has been like preached to us. You're resilient, resilient. Keep calm, soldier on. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Put your big girl panties on. Whatever euphemism you want to use, we believe that, but it's not actually happening in our lives because, from what I believe, is we're missing this big component of religion, spirituality, because we just tippy toe around it.
I mean, you hit on so many things. And this is why I think resilience has become such a dirty word, because we're told we're resilient. And yet we are struggling, right? Either resilience doesn't help us or we're not actually resilient, which is what your study showed, is that, if we think we're resilient and yet we're not able to show those measures of what actual resilience are, then there's something that doesn't match.
There's a disconnect, right? A gap.
So we have this disconnect, and we can feel something's not lining up here, but we don't often know what to do with that information. So we just continue across the board to struggle. So talk about religion and spirituality and kind of break that down, because I think you're absolutely right. Every time I go and I read something and it's like, yes, spiritual practices help us, but it's defined in so many different ways. And it's kind of like this thing that, as you said, everybody tiptoes around, and we're like, okay, this is going to help, but we can't tell you what it is or how to put it into practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that's what I found again in my study is I started out with the, let me get the actual name of it up here. It's the BMMRSS. So Brief Multidimensional Measure of Religion and Spirituality Scale. So when I did that global score for my study, not everything was statistically significant. I was like, well, that's kind of a bummer. Darn. But then I broke it down and looked at the subscales that it was component. So there was like an organized religion subscale and the daily spiritual experiences, religious coping. There were several of them. And I looked at the components of those questions and I was like, oh, this is heavily weighted on the religious side. And so for me personally, and as a science practitioner, as a researcher, for me, religion is more of the practice of the going to church. Kind of it leans a little bit more on the rules side, which is where things can get a little dicey, because if you grew up in a church that maybe really pushed rules hard, and there's a lot of denominations out there that are very rules, check the box kind of thing over the relationship piece, that actually can be a little bit detrimental. And I didn't get too far into that because I was like, that's beyond the scope of my study, and I'll see something shiny and I'll never come back from that, right?
Yep.
We'll never graduate. So the religious component, which I think is a little, quote, easier to do, but maybe slightly less effective. Like, you can go to church and not get anything out of it. You can have a quiet time and not get anything out of it because and I say you, I'm generalizing here, maybe we are just checking the box and it feels pressurized versus the experiential piece of believing, for me personally as a Christian, like the relationship with Jesus Christ, what he has done for us, how the Holy Spirit moves in my life. Because I have people ask me all the time, most of us have, like, oh my goodness, you're a military spouse, I don't know how you do it. And I'm like, Jesus is all the answer for me, right? Because I don't know. Truly, I do not know. God bless him, how spouses do it without him. Like, it is already hard when I've got the savior of the world in my corner. But I was like, how does that work? Like, it's just so hard and so heavy. So, again, the religious coping was more about the relationship, that comfort, that connection with, quote, a higher power. Because I didn't frame it from a Christian perspective. One of my questions was also, what's your denomination? Like, what is your religion/denomination? Now, 80-something% did weigh in as Christians. whether, whatever quote flavor you want to say of Christians. But the spiritual piece is more focused on the relationship of not only with people, but really that higher power, the comfort piece, instead of the check, check, check. So I do believe that going to church is very helpful. I do encounter, the Holy Spirit frequently when I go to church. It empowers me for the week, but it's so multidimensional. And I think that's why it's so hard to nail down is, well, like, what is it? And it's a little bit different for everybody. Some people are really going to connect with the Lord via nature and worship or song. And other folks are like, man, I love journaling and writing the Bible. And other people are like, I just want to be with the people. I want people to pray for me and I want to pray for that, again. And again, that goes off onto this tangent of spiritual gifts and community and all of these things. So I think that was kind of the differentiation on that.
Well, I think it's important because as we were talking, I guess, a week or so ago on the show, we were talking about mental and emotional health and how different practices work for different people. And I think that's true for each element of our life. It's going to not be just this one thing. And if you do this one thing, then you're going to get this outcome. And it's personal to each of us. So it's really trying these different things and figuring out, okay, what is it that I need to grow in this area? What is it that I need to deepen my growth in this area? And so spiritual practices are the same way. And yet we're often so afraid of offending other people or trying to make it fit a certain way that we just don't talk about it at all. But I would love for you to just speak for a moment, because I know there are those listening right now who have grown up in this fear-based environment where the term Christian is not associated with comfort and with peace, but with fear and a whole lot of rules. What would you like to say to that person?
So to anyone listening that grew up in that atmosphere, or maybe has been hurt by the church, or overwhelmed, burdened by this giant list of rules and the do's and the don'ts, that's not Jesus. That's not Jesus. The church hurt piece, that the people that hurt you or that put all this on you, like, I am a performer, I'm an achiever, which is why I struggled with perfectionism growing up. That wasn't put on me by my parents. Like, I created that as my own coping mechanism. And let me tell you, it did not work. Like, it fake worked for a while until it was like, I can't be perfect, and then it will break you. So I think it's hard and it's scary and it's painful, but I can speak from personal experience. That initial struggle is worth it to navigate through and process and pay attention to our feelings. Like, our feelings are valid and important, but sometimes they're not true. And that's kind of hard for me to say, because my feelings sometimes feel real true and real powerful. And I'll be like, there cannot be any other capital T truth. Has to be true. But again, the enemy, Satan, will lie to us and be like, you see that person that hurts you? That's what Jesus is. Like, we believe it because it hurts so much. But there's a lot of power in paying attention and leaning in to understand what grace really is. That is something, again, for my fellow perfectionists, recovering perfectionists, people pleasers, and achievers, grace is like a foreign language. But there's space for that. Like, that is what Jesus came to this earth to fill those gaps. It's not up to us to save ourselves. Thank goodness, because it ain't gonna work. Again, hashtag ask me how I know. So understand that in this world we will have suffering. That's a biblical principle. That's, recently I read it in another book. It's like, we will have suffering one way or another. Is it going to be suffering just because we're suffering and it's painful? Or are we going to seek that godly suffering that is going to produce fruit? Because I am a testimony. Again, I will start preaching and get all fired up about He has delivered me from depths of things that I could not comprehend. So, full transparency, during my dissertation process, at nearing the very end, I was so overwhelmed and so truly depressed. I was on antidepressants, SSRIs, and had been on them for about 4 years, but then they started working too well. Okay? They started working too much, and it actually pushed me. My anxiety, plus or minus, was kind of gone, which is one big reason why I started them after my son was born, is anxiety and depression. But they had pushed me so far into the dark, and I was so overwhelmed by this dissertation because there's so many obstacles that come with doing a project, not just a dissertation, but when you're trying to get information like this that could potentially, not for my glory, but for God's glory, maybe impact the kingdom, even if one person hears this and it makes them scratch their head or tugs on their heart a little, there will be significant opposition. And so near the end of my dissertation process, I felt overwhelmed and hopeless. I was I'm having thoughts. I'm having thoughts of suicide, right? Military spouses and the military sector, that has a very high prevalence rate compared to civilians of suicidality. You add in PhD or doctoral students with that, good grief. And this was on the tail end of the pandemic. And so the social isolation that came with that, and also the dissertation cave. Anyways, I'm digressing, but I was unwell in this, but I saw the Lord again for probably the 100th time get me through this suffering to produce fruit, Christine, that I truly, good grief, could not have manufactured myself. He redeemed that experience, not only to let me have this conversation today, but also to give me a job where I am walking and coming alongside other dissertation students to be I fully understand how hard this is. Because when they offered me that position, I burst into tears, not in a good way, but I was I've done one dissertation and it sucked and I hated it. Ugh. And my husband was first of all, calm down. Let's just see how this goes. But the Lord, and I was I don't know what I'm doing. But he said, and then I talked to my supervisor. He was look, Sharita, we just need you to be a good coach and a mentor. And I was I can do that. I love that piece. And it's been so cool to see in the last 2+ years of the people that I've been able to help, not only from the mill spouse perspective, but the students that are going through this too. So again, 2 Corinthians, the God of all comfort, bringing us through hard times so that we can come alongside and comfort other people. So this is a very long diatribe, very long monologue here about if you've been hurt, if you are struggling, trust me when I say, if you are able to cling to our Savior and lean into that and do those hard things and be mindful and pay attention to what you're actually feeling and seek truth, fruit will come from that. It might take a while, but there is godly suffering that produces fruit versus just suffering to suffer.
Well, and it's amazing how so much of the time, what becomes our purpose, the thing that we feel called on our hearts to do, comes out of something that we have walked through. That hard season, that difficult time, we're then able to in turn help others through that and make it a little less painful for them, and how what we go through can be used for good. And I think that's the thing that I want everyone to hold on to, is just to keep seeking truth. Keep asking those questions and looking for fruit, because it's the fruit that matters. And is this helping you? Is this bringing true joy and comfort and peace? Or is it just something that's adding to the burden, that's adding to the stress and the fear that you feel?
Yeah, it's not meant to be heavy. Like, sure, it might be a little question marky and a little confusing, and it might be hard. But again, those biblical principles, his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Like, when I finally understood that and I still struggle with it, I'm like, wait a minute. He's not just putting this whole giant to-do list on me for something new to carry because I feel like I'm drowning. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. Like, that's where we miss it, because we'll create things, these expectations or these rules that we put on ourselves. And again, I'm not saying that doesn't require maybe some sacrifice, a little bit of effort, a good amount of intentionality of the posture of our hearts. That's what it comes down to. He's not sitting up there like with a clipboard and a checklist being like, yep, yep, yep. No, like invite the Lord into your life and start to taste that freedom and feel the lightness, feel the rest that will come, sometimes immediately and sometimes over this process of time.
Yeah. Now, I know that so much of Christianese, if you will, has this idea of like, oh, just trust the Lord, which, sounds great, but we're like, what does that mean practically? How do we grow? How do we put these religious coping practices into our lives if we're not just following a checklist or trying to do a list of rules? So talk to us about how we step into that.
That is a tall order, for sure. And I still, all these years later, struggle with it. But again, that's the sanctification process. I don't know if I was whining, maybe lamenting, complaining a little bit at PWC yesterday here at Fort Bliss, Protestant Women in the Chapel. I was like, this is taking forever. I was talking about something I'm trying to grow with and, focus on. And someone beside me was like, yeah, you're right, Sharita. Sanctification is a slow process. And I'm just like, wrap it up. Let's go. Right. So 13 years ago, I think it's 13 years ago now, I do the 1-word challenge every year. And for me, that's been very powerful. And when I say challenge, it's not like an achievement thing, but it's a paying attention thing. And so my 1 word then 13 years ago was trust. Foundational. And I've seen over 13 years of how that has grown and built on like future words, grace and peace and rest and growth and stand. I have a whole big list, right? Strength and hope. And this year is favor, which even favor was scary for me of like, but I don't deserve that. Why would there be favor upon, like, okay, again, biblically, favor is upon us. We are God's chosen people. So that foundational piece of trust goes back to paying attention. Okay, XYZ happened. Like, and if you're truly following the Lord, I would be so bold as to challenge everyone listening to really think, has the Lord ever truly failed you? Like, I cannot come up with a single moment in my life when he's failed me. Now, that doesn't mean that I haven't had heartbreak and disappointment and grief and questions and all, like, depression, disappointment. Like, I'm not saying that it hasn't been without adversity or trial, but I fully believe that he's never left me in that. So paying attention to that trust, like leaning in of, okay, Lord, I really do believe that you'll help me through this. And it doesn't have to be, again, a huge belief of no doubts. He doesn't judge us for doubting. Look at the folks in the Bible who were like, I'm going to need to touch the holes in your hands and your side before I believe you. Can I really walk on water? I can until I take my eyes off of you, right? And even it says like, help me in my unbelief. Like, that is a beautiful prayer of like, I'm struggling with this PCS or this deployment or my kid or my job or finances or fill in the blank, my health. Lord, I know that you're good in my head. I'm struggling to believe in my heart. Help me in my unbelief. So that little tiny piece, that little tiny faith of a mustard seed, he's going to honor that. And the more you trust him, the more you'll be able to trust him.
Such a great first step is just to be open to it, to say, I want this in my life, and yet I struggle to believe it, and help me with my unbelief. And again, if we are seeking truth, then just come and ask that question and see how God shows up. Because you don't have to do anything except open yourself up to the possibility that there is a God who is real and able to help you in your struggle.
Right, and understanding that he loves us. Bottom line, no matter what. End of discussion, hard stop. So nothing we do or don't do will make God love us more or less. The minute that we say, okay, come into my heart. I don't know, I'm a hot mess. I don't know what I'm doing with my hands. My brain's all scrambled up. I don't know what's truth. I don't want, but the minute we say, I'm yours, Lord, nothing we can do will change his love for us. And again, for my perfectionist performers, achievers listening, that is huge. Now, so yes, we accept that. We receive it. We're open to that. We fully have permission to lay on the couch and watch Netflix the rest of our life, right? Neglect our husband, neglect our kid, whatever. However, God will still love us, hard stop. But we will miss out on the abundant life that he's given us, that fruit and that experience. So it's multifaceted and multi-layered, but it's not about achievement or performance. It's about humbling ourselves and being vulnerable of sometimes I have exhausted all possible options and avenues. I have nothing left. And as much as that seems like a devastating point to be at, once we invite the Lord into that process, there is hope that, again, nothing in the world, no spouse, no kid, no amount of money, no career, no nothing could create or manufacture in or through or for us.
So good. So good. And so as we are wrapping up today, I know that some of you will still have lots of questions about what this can look like in your own life. Sharita, would you just let everybody know how they can connect with you and learn more about your dissertation, learn more about what you are doing, and how they can continue to grow in their spiritual faith?
Absolutely. So you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Sharita Knobloch, Sharrit as in Tango A, Knobloch, or you can email me, sharita.knobloch@gmail.com. I love having conversations with folks. I would love to meet with you via Zoom. It may have to be after our PCS, but it's just such a heart. I just have such a heart for this only because I've been there, done that, cried the tears, wept and gnashed my teeth, struggled, all of those things. And God has brought me through it and continues to bring me through it. And it is a complete and total joy to come alongside other spouses, other researchers, whoever's listening, to bring glory to God and to maybe help you through a hurdle or answer a question or point you towards the Lord's truth when it's hard to decipher because it really gets fuzzy sometimes.
Yeah, and yet it's so, so important. And as your research shows, when we do these practices, when we make this a part of our life, it impacts all of these other areas of our life. And we have this research that backs this up. And so I just want to say thank you for coming on today. Thank you for sharing with us, because what you are doing matters and what you have done matters. And I know that what you are going to do in the future matters, and it is making such a difference. So thank you for sharing with us today.
You are so welcome, Christine, and thank you for the opportunity to share. It is truly a joy and a privilege, and I don't take it lightly.
Friend, I would love to hear your thoughts and any questions you have surrounding today's episode. I know spiritual health is something we often tiptoe around, but as research indicates, religious coping positively impacts our mental health and resilience. So maybe it's time to stop tiptoeing around the idea. So let's end the episode here. What is one thing you can do to grow in this area? I know what this one thing is for me. It's being in a community with other women focused on spiritual growth. It was a challenge for me to find this at our last assignment, and something that I am being very mindful of as we get settled into our new location. I don't know what that one thing is for you, but I do know there is always something you can do to grow when it comes to spiritual health. Maybe for you, it's just getting curious, learning more about spirituality, about the possibility of God or a higher power. Maybe it's deconstructing the beliefs that you held on to as a kid. Or maybe it's understanding that we are all imperfect people and that maybe you were hurt by a person or by a church, but you are still loved and wanted and created with and for a purpose. And my hope and my prayer is that you will open yourself up to the possibility that there is a God who loves you, who created you, who longs to be in relationship with you, and who wants to help you in the good times and in the bad. Friend, you are loved. And until next time, may you live filled, fueled, and full of joy. Hey, Amazing Mill Spouse, before you go, I want you to know that I love hearing from you. The More Than a Mill Spouse community exists to help you thrive as a military spouse. Figure out what lights your heart on fire and empower you to live with purpose and impact. You can have an incredible impact simply by heading over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a review. But your impact doesn't stop there. You can empower those around you simply by sharing an episode with a friend or neighbor, someone who needs a little encouragement in this military life. And if this episode was meaningful to you, spread the love by taking a screenshot of this episode and tagging me on Instagram so we can continue to reach more people, change more lives, and shift the way that military spouses look at life. Because we are better together, and together we can change the world. Let's do it.